Rosemary Webb had never imagined silence could be this loud. Her cottage in Tenby, nestled between the cliffs and wildflower meadows, had always been full of life. Laughter from her daughter Amelia, the quiet humming of her late husband mending garden tools, the barking of next-door's spaniel, those sounds used to make the house breathe. But now, all she had was the tick of the old clock and the kettle whistling far too often. After her husband, William, passed away 3 years ago, Rosemary found comfort in her daughter's calls. Amelia had moved to London with dreams big enough to fill every room of the small house she'd left behind. She would ring almost daily, updating her mother on new clients, new dresses, new plans with Dominic, her boyfriend who worked in finance and liked speaking too quickly. Then came the silence. At first, Rosemary thought it was the usual busyness. A missed call here, a late reply there. But the days stretched into weeks. When she finally called, it went straight to voicemail. No messages, no updates. Just an empty ringtone and the hollow space it left behind. The silence turned bitter when she learned through a neighbor's niece, who followed Amelia on social media, that Amelia and Dominic were planning a grand countryside wedding. Rosemary hadn't been told. Not a word. Not a mention. She stood by the window that evening, holding the cup of tea she no longer wanted. The garden, once her husband's pride, was now overgrown. The shed, where he had carved their initials into the wooden beam, was barely visible through the ivy. That space, that home, once filled with stories, had been forgotten by the one person she'd given everything for. That night, Rosemary wandered into the shed for the first time in months. Dust swirled in the beam of her torchlight. The place smelled of old wooden memories. She sat on the bench William had built and let her hand rest on the carving that read, R&W, 1981. Something inside her stirred, not sadness, but something sharper, clearer. She would not let herself fade into the quiet. Without making a fuss, Rosemary rang an old friend, Callum, who now worked with the parish and organized local events. She asked him if anyone ever needed a venue for small community gatherings. He laughed and said they always struggled to find space for book clubs, gardening groups, or even afternoon teas for the elderly. Rosemary listened carefully and said, "I might have something." She looked around the shed. Dusty, crooked, forgotten. But with the right hands, it could be something again. Just like her. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Rosemary woke before sunrise each morning, wrapped in William's old gardening coat, and walked down to the shed with a flask of tea and a notebook full of ideas. The shed was still leaning slightly to one side, and the ivy was stubborn, but she had made her decision. This wasn't just a project. It was a reclaiming. With Callum's help, she found a retired carpenter named Mr. Hughes who lived 2 lanes over. He remembered William and insisted on helping for next to nothing. "Your husband once fixed my bike chain in the rain," he said, brushing sawdust from his jumper. "I never forgot that." Soon, the floor was reinforced, the windows repaired, and a fresh coat of pale green paint covered the tired wooden walls. Word began to spread. Neighbors came by with tools, spare shelves, old teapots. A pair of teenagers, twins named Ella and Max, offered to repaint the garden bench and planted rosemary and thyme along the edges. Rosemary didn't say much, but every thank you carried the weight of something deeper. She was not forgotten. She was not finished. Inside the shed, she arranged a circle of mismatched chairs and set up a kettle with a proper tin of biscuits. Books lined the new wooden shelves, classics, gardening manuals, cookbooks, poetry. When Callum came to inspect it a week later, he simply stood in the doorway, smiling. "Rosemary," he said quietly, "this isn't just a space. It's a story waiting to be told." They called it the Chapter Shed. By the second week, it hosted its first group, 3 widows from the village who came with knitting in hand and stories in their eyes. They sat and talked for hours while the kettle boiled over and the clock ticked gently in the background. One even left a small jar of homemade jam behind, with a note, "For you, because you reminded me how to talk again." One evening, Rosemary stood by the edge of the garden and watched the light spill out through the shed's small windows. It glowed like a lantern in the dusk. The garden had begun to bloom again, not perfectly, but honestly. Weeds still poked through the gravel path, but that didn't matter. She was wiping down the old wooden table when her mobile rang. It was Amelia. Rosemary stared at the screen for a long moment. The name blinked steadily, like a pulse. Then she answered. "Mum," came the voice, uncertain and rushed. Dominic and I, we need to ask you something. It's about the wedding." Rosemary didn't reply straight away. She looked around the shed. The chipped teacups. The folded blankets. The little brass bell by the door. "We lost our venue," Amelia continued. "Something with the contract. And everywhere else is booked. We don't know what to do." There was a silence that stretched, not unkindly, but with weight. Then Amelia said, more softly, "Could we maybe use the garden? Just for one day?" Rosemary placed the cloth back on the table and stepped outside. The evening air smelled of earth and lemon balm. She glanced at the shed, standing proud and gentle behind her. The place that had reminded her who she was. She said only, "Come by tomorrow. We'll talk." Amelia arrived the next morning just after 9, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a takeaway coffee as if it might shield her from the past. Dominic trailed behind her, speaking into his phone with a grim look, then offering Rosemary a polite nod without removing his earbuds. Rosemary stood by the shed in her gardening gloves, sleeves rolled up, a trowel still in hand. She didn't move to greet them. Instead, she turned and picked a weed from the rosemary bush by the door. "You've kept the place," Amelia said after a moment. "It's tidier than I remember." Rosemary let the silence hang before replying, "Some things are worth keeping." Amelia cleared her throat and pulled out a printed folder from her bag. "We were thinking, chairs here, the ceremony by the elder tree, and the catering van could park near the shed. It won't disrupt anything, I promise." Dominic finally looked up from his phone. "It would just be the one day, Mrs. Webb. It's not a big ask. We're in a tight spot. Surely you understand." Rosemary raised an eyebrow. "And who would be paying for this use of the garden?" Amelia blinked. "Mum, we thought, well, it's your garden." "My garden," Rosemary repeated slowly, "that no one visited for over a year. Not even when the apple tree collapsed or when I had shingles." Amelia's cheeks flushed pink. "I was busy." Rosemary nodded once. "So was I." She turned toward the shed and opened the door. The morning sun spilled inside, casting golden light across the circle of chairs, the shelves of books, the drawings tacked up by local children. It no longer looked like a storage space, it looked like purpose. "This is the chapter shed now. It belongs to the community. I open it 3 days a week for people who need it more than you need one perfect photo under a tree." Amelia stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to forget you. We just got swept up. London moves so fast." Rosemary's tone softened, but only slightly. "I didn't stop moving, Amelia. I simply stopped waiting." Dominic, now realizing this wasn't going to be as simple as a nod and a smile, finally put his phone away. "Look, maybe we can arrange something more official. Payment. A proper agreement." Rosemary considered this, then gestured toward the side gate. "The garden can be used. But on terms set by me." Amelia looked up hopefully. "So we can have it?" "You can borrow it," Rosemary replied, "like everything borrowed with care. But there will be no grand decorations, no artificial backdrops, no plastic marquees. If you want this space, it stays as it is. Wild. Honest." Amelia hesitated, glancing at Dominic, who shrugged. It's not what we planned, but it could work. Rosemary looked toward the shed one last time. You'll find the best memories are often the ones you never plan. As Amelia and Dominic wandered around measuring spaces and whispering logistics, Rosemary returned to her shed. She placed her trowel back on its hook and lit a small lavender candle on the windowsill. Outside, the garden was no longer empty. It was about to witness something new, on her terms. The days leading up to the wedding were unlike anything Rosemary had imagined. The garden buzzed, not with chaos, but with a gentle rhythm. Local children helped handmade bunting made from scraps of fabric. The women from the knitting group donated crocheted garlands and stitched napkins. Mr. Hughes dropped by with lanterns he had wired himself, glowing softly by dusk. Amelia tried to take charge at first. She arrived each morning with printed schedules, color palettes, and firm instructions about where the guests would stand and how the chairs must be aligned. But every time she tried to impose a little glamour, the garden gently resisted. The earth was uneven. The breeze blew ribbons loose. The rosemary bushes insisted on leaning just as they pleased. And somehow, that simplicity began to soften her. One afternoon, Rosemary found Amelia alone in the shed, seated in one of the mismatched chairs, holding an old poetry book from the shelf. She didn't look up straight away. I used to read this to you when you were little, Rosemary said gently. You always liked the poem about the lighthouse. Amelia traced the page. I remember. You did the voices. I thought you sounded like a wave. There was a long silence, but not an awkward one. Outside, someone was laughing. Somewhere, the kettle clicked. Amelia spoke again, this time quieter. Why didn't I come back sooner? Rosemary didn't answer directly. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the garden, lanterns swinging softly in the wind, the trellis wrapped in ivy, a group of teenagers tying ribbons between branches. I didn't stop being your mother, even when you stopped needing one. Amelia closed the book and set it carefully on the shelf. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday morning thick with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh dew. There were no stretch limos or red carpets. Instead, neighbors arrived on bicycles and in wellies, carrying folding chairs and homemade jam jars filled with wildflowers. Rosemary wore a pale lavender dress she hadn't touched in years, with her silver hair in a neat twist. She stood by the shed, greeting guests like an old queen in her kingdom. When Dominic arrived, slightly wide-eyed at the down-to-earth setting, he whispered, "It's not what we expected, but it feels right." The ceremony took place under the elder tree, where a circle of chairs had been placed just as they were, some old, some newer, none matching. The backdrop was not silk but the garden itself, blooming in all its unmanicured honesty. As Amelia walked down the grass aisle, hand in hand with her father's memory more than anything else, Rosemary caught the moment her daughter looked up and truly saw her. Not as someone left behind, but as someone who had quietly, defiantly built something beautiful. The vows were exchanged under soft birdsong. There were no string quartets, only the occasional breeze and the rustle of leaves. And when they kissed, the entire garden clapped, not out of politeness, but because it had become theirs too. The place, the moment, the change. Later, as the sun dipped low, music from a local folk group began to play. Children danced barefoot, someone poured elderflower cordial into chipped mugs, and laughter rose like smoke above the hedges. Rosemary sat on the bench near the shed, watching it all, not as a spectator, but as the quiet architect of something both old and new. The wedding was over, but the garden still felt alive. For the first time in years, the laughter lingered long after the last guest had gone. Rosemary stood by the elder tree the next morning, holding her tea as the breeze rustled through petals scattered on the grass. It was quiet, but not empty. Amelia and Dominic had stayed the night in the cottage's spare room. It had been awkward at first. Rosemary had folded fresh sheets and laid out clean towels without saying much. But there had been no tension, only a kind of careful grace. Over breakfast, Dominic offered to fix the gate that had always leaned since the last storm. Amelia washed the mugs. It wasn't dramatic, just different. And that difference mattered. That afternoon, as Rosemary prepared the shed for the weekly reading group, Amelia appeared at the door holding a small cardboard box. "I found this in your loft," she said. "Behind the suitcases. I think it's from Dad." Rosemary set down the teapot and took the box with slow hands. The cardboard was soft with age, the edges worn. Inside were 3 notebooks wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. On top sat a letter with her name in William's familiar, slightly crooked handwriting. She sat down in the corner chair and opened it. "My Rosie. If you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to show you what I've been writing. I know you always said my stories were better told out loud, but I started writing them down after I got ill. They're all set here, in this garden, in this shed, about love, time, and how we grow even when no one sees it. If you ever feel forgotten, I hope you'll read them and remember, this place isn't just yours. It's ours. And maybe one day, it can be someone else's too. All my love, always. W." Rosemary didn't cry, but she felt the warmth of something return to her chest. A flicker. A flame. She looked up at Amelia, who stood quietly, arms folded. "He wrote all this?" Amelia nodded. "And there's more. Drawings. Maps of the garden, little notes. He must have spent months on it." Rosemary carefully untied the first bundle. The handwriting was familiar, William's looping script, the way he dotted his I's with a slight hook. Each page was filled with characters, dialogues, and reflections that sounded like his voice in her ear. "He wrote stories about this place," she murmured. "Maybe," Amelia said softly, "you could read them to the others. In the shed." That evening, instead of the usual reading group, Rosemary gathered her regular visitors for something different. She placed a photo of William on the shelf, lit the lavender candle, and opened the first notebook. Chapter 1, she read aloud, "The Man Who Planted Stars." The listeners leaned in, the kettle hissed, and the garden listened too. Outside, the shed glowed in the dusk. Not just as a place for memories, but as the beginning of new ones, written long ago, waiting for the right moment to be shared. Weeks passed, but the story of the chapter shed refused to quiet down. What had begun as a quiet corner for books and tea had become something far greater. Every Thursday evening, the shed filled with villagers, some with knitting in their laps, some simply there to listen. Rosemary read from William's notebooks, each chapter revealing a character or place they all recognized from the village, transformed through his tender imagination. Word traveled beyond Tenby. A small article appeared in the local paper, "The Widow Who Turned Her Garden Shed into a Living Library." Then a schoolteacher from Pembroke asked to bring her students for poetry sessions. Someone from a hospice group requested copies of William's stories for their patients. Rosemary always said yes. It was not about attention. It was about connection. Amelia began visiting regularly. Not just as a daughter, but as a helper. She helped repaint the bench, labeled the bookshelves, brought new cushions for the chairs. At first, she still checked her phone often, nervously tugged at her sleeves. But slowly, she softened too. She brought stories of her own, and once, she even read aloud from William's final chapter, her voice shaking but steady. One afternoon, after a quiet session, Dominic stayed behind to help move some old garden tools. He was not talkative, but he worked carefully, with quiet purpose. When they finished, he turned to Rosemary and said, "I never really understood what this place meant. I do now." Rosemary smiled, handing him a folded cloth to wipe his hands. Understanding comes slower than silence. But it lasts longer. Then came the letter. It arrived in a simple white envelope, posted from Carmarthen. Rosemary almost set it aside, thinking it was another thank you note or a community notice, but when she opened it, the air in the shed seemed to still. It was from the Carmarthenshire Arts Trust. They had read about the chapter shed, and one of their board members had attended a reading in secret. They wanted to fund the project, officially. Enough money to renovate the shed into a fully equipped literacy and arts centre, install proper heating, and even publish William's stories in a printed collection. For a moment, Rosemary just stared at the letter. Her fingers trembled slightly. She folded it carefully, tucked it into her pocket, and walked outside. The garden was quiet again. The elder tree stood tall, blossoms like stars in the canopy. The bench was still damp with morning dew. But it was no longer just a garden. It was a gathering. A growing. She didn't announce the news straight away. Not yet. Instead, she opened the shed door and stood in the center of the room. The air smelled of paper, lavender, and pine oil. She ran her fingers along the bookshelf William had once dreamt of, now real and humming with life. And there, in the quiet that was never empty, something began again. News of the funding spread faster than Rosemary expected. The community buzzed with quiet pride, and offers to help flooded in, from carpenters who wanted to volunteer, to students eager to record the readings for a local podcast. The chapter shed was no longer just a space, it had become a symbol. But not everyone shared the excitement. It started with a phone call. Amelia took it on speaker in the kitchen one morning while Rosemary washed strawberries by the sink. "Mum," she said, her voice sharp with confusion, "James is on the line." James Webb. Rosemary's eldest. The son who hadn't called in over 2 years. He hadn't even written after William's passing. "Hello, Mother," came his clipped, polished tone. "I read something interesting in the paper. About a shed becoming a community center on private property." Rosemary dried her hands slowly. "Yes. That's correct." There was a pause before he continued, more legal now, more clipped. "Have you updated the title deed? Is it still in your name, or have you foolishly handed it over to some village trust?" Amelia's face fell. Rosemary spoke calmly. "It's still in my name. For now." "Good," James snapped. "Then you'll understand why I must insist, firmly, that you do nothing further without legal consultation. That house and land are part of our family assets. You've no right to give away what's meant to be inherited." Rosemary didn't flinch. "I built this garden with your father. You left long before the ivy reached the shed roof. You don't get to inherit what you never loved." James scoffed. "Don't make this sentimental. Think clearly. I'm speaking with our solicitor. If this gets formalized under any community ownership, you could find yourself removed from your own property." The call ended as suddenly as it began. Amelia sat down at the table, stunned. "He's serious," she whispered. "He'd take the house." Rosemary stood by the window, looking out at the shed, now hung with paper stars made by local children, their names scribbled across them in crayon. "They can try," she said. "But you can't take something that belongs to everyone." Later that day, she met with Fiona Hartley, her solicitor and old friend. They drank tea in the back room of Fiona's converted barn office, papers strewn between them. "If you really want to protect the shed," Fiona said, "you'll need to transfer its ownership into a trust. One that can't be sold. One that belongs to the community, in perpetuity." Rosemary nodded. "And the house?" Fiona hesitated. "That's trickier. You can transfer it too, but you'd be giving up control. You'd still live here, but technically, it wouldn't be yours anymore." Rosemary looked down at the photograph she'd brought. William holding a hammer, his hair wind-blown, smiling in front of the half-built shed. "I don't need to own it," she said. "I just need to know no one like James ever can." By week's end, the trust was created. The chapter shed and a small parcel of the land surrounding it, including the elder tree and the reading bench, were no longer part of the family estate. They belonged to the village now. To memory. To the future. Rosemary posted the final deed on the wall inside the shed, framed in recycled wood. It read simply, "For those who feel forgotten. For those still finding their voice." She didn't call James. She didn't need to. She had chosen who would inherit her world. And it wasn't him. The seasons turned gently, as they always did in Tenby. By early autumn, the garden had shifted, sunflowers drooped in farewell, ivy thickened along the stone wall, and apples fell in clusters onto the grass with soft, familiar thuds. But the chapter sheds stayed open. Every Thursday evening, more people came. Some brought blankets, others brought silence. There were pensioners who hadn't spoken to neighbors in years, teenagers who stayed behind to ask questions about poetry, and a widower named Mr. Ellis who read aloud his late wife's letters, trembling but smiling. Rosemary never missed a session. But by mid-October, something in her began to slow. She tired more easily. Her walks to the shed took a little longer. Still, she smiled, still welcomed each visitor like an old friend. One night, after the group had left and the stars were sharp above the trees, Rosemary stayed behind. She sat in the reading chair, William's final notebook resting on her lap, unopened. She looked around the shed, the fairy lights, the scent of lavender, the bookshelf, the framed deed. Then she picked up her pen. She didn't write a goodbye. She wrote a beginning. For whoever finds this, the world will try to convince you that the only things that matter are the ones you can own. Titles. Keys. Deeds. But you and I know different. We know that what truly belongs to us is what we build with our hands and give with our hearts. You cannot inherit a garden you never tended. You cannot claim a home you never visited. You cannot buy love with legal rights. If you're here, then this place has already found you. And that's enough. Take care of it, will you? And let it take care of you. With all my hope. Webb. She left the letter on the desk inside a wooden box marked for tomorrow, alongside William's notebooks. Then she closed the door behind her. 2 days later, Amelia found her in the garden chair beneath the elder tree, wrapped in her old blue shawl, a book open in her lap, her face turned to the light. She had gone quietly, without fuss, as if becoming one with the earth she had nurtured. The village gathered in the garden for the memorial. There was no grand ceremony. Only shared readings, soft tears, and laughter that fluttered like petals on the breeze. They planted a small plaque beneath the elder tree that read, "She grew stories, not walls." Amelia took over the shed. She didn't try to become her mother. She simply kept the door open. The readings continued. The kettle still hissed. New notebooks appeared, filled with voices from all walks of life. And every time a new visitor walked through the gate, someone would point to the bench and say, "That's where she used to sit." The one who gave it all away before anyone could take it. Because Rosemary Webb had left behind something more enduring than land or a title. She left behind a place no one could ever steal.